Okay, I think I'm live. Gotta get a little better centered here. There we go. All right. So, can people hear me? Can you see me? Are there people out there? I'm assuming so. Let me just pop this out. Well, hello there. Okay, I guess things are working as near as far as I can tell. Anyway, here we are. I'm just escaping the news. That's my goal. I want to get away from the news. So I'm doing this instead for at least a little while. We'll see how it goes. So you remember me? I used to make YouTube videos once upon a time. Now I've been pretty bad at it. So the situation is uh, that this has been a terrible, terrible semester for me. I'm teaching a new course. I'm and it's to non-majors, which is always a struggle. It's easier to get made biology majors motivated to listen to me talk about biology, and they're more willing to contribute. So it's been a little bit of a struggle. Um, let's put my hearing gadgets in. So it's been a little bit of a struggle there, and then I'm also teaching an intro course, and oh, getting geared up because next term I teach genetics again. I like teaching genetics, so it's all fine. So that on top of that is that my wife is working nights, so I'm here all alone. Yeah, Ugh. It's terrible. I'm alone most of the time nowadays, and then I'm stuck doing things like preparing for classes the next day, which has been a bit of a headache. So uh, then I realized that tonight I am going to be tempted to turn on the news. And you guys out there, your mission is to prevent me from doing anything so foolish. So I really don't want to talk about or watch the news. I I'm going to wait until tomorrow and see how things go. I hope they go well. Otherwise, I feel like, oh yeah, we're it's like we're standing at the beginning of the fall of Rome, and uh, it could be very, very bad. So we'll see. We'll see. But let's stop thinking about politics. Politics is awful right now. So here's what I was thinking of doing is I was going to talk a little bit about evolution because I got really irritated at Reddit of all things. I don't normally read Reddit very often. Every once in a while, I'll glance in and see if they're saying anything. Um, but Reddit is, how to put this? Once upon a time, I was very active in a news group called Talk Origins, which was great. It had a large number of idiotic creationists who'd come by, and a large number of spectators, and then most importantly, it had a good solid base of scientists who were checking in all the time. So you couldn't say much that was foolish without getting called out. And this was not a kind calling out. Things could get mean in there. Um, so I thought I'd try to check into Reddit, see if there was anything similar going on there that would interest me. And more often than not, I find myself just getting irritated because the discussions are there's a few good discussions and there's a lot of really bad discussions, and it doesn't have that level of hostility from qualified people. I know that sounds terrible, doesn't it? That hostility is an important component of these kinds of discussions because we gotta squash some of these bad ideas. So anyway, what I thought I would do to start the discussion, just to begin with, and then I see we've already got questions out there, but then eventually I can just stop ranting about this, and you can ask me questions, and I'll see if I can answer them. Okay, so here's the deal. I checked into Reddit a few weeks ago, just a glance, and I found this post. It's titled, "Are microevolution and macroevolution legitimate terms?" And to cut the long story short, yes, they are. They're very definitely legitimate terms. It was posted by somebody, um, who I'm gonna tell you what his qualifications are. Oh, not so quick. Uh, his his bio says 23M, so 23-year-old guy, engineering graduate. Oh, yeah, already my spidey sense is tingling. You know, engineers don't have a great reputation in discussions of biology. So he's an engineering graduate. Come back, it keeps disappearing on me. Um, and it says, "I don't know a damn thing, but I'll try." His hobbies are aquaponics, K-pop, okay, cyberbullying creationists. That's another worrisome thing is, come on, you've gotta be at least a little better qualified, a little better informed to be discussing evolutionary biology than being an engineer who likes to pick on creationists. That's not a good start. So anyway, his article, and I won't read the whole thing. It goes on way too long, but it's titled "Are Microevolution and Macroevolution Legitimate Terms?" And he's he's basically arguing that this topic has come up before, most often between evolution proponents. And he says, "I've almost never seen people asserting one way or the other, using anecdotes at most, and never going any deeper. So I wanted to make this post." Okay, he's complaining that people didn't go deep enough. Yet, what does his post say? Well, the first thing he says is he looked it up in Campbell biology. Okay, he looked up the terms micro and macroevolution in Campbell biology. I am very familiar with Campbell biology. I have taught for years out of Campbell biology. Um, Campbell biology is an introductory college level textbook. We use it for like first year students and sometimes for a second year a little bit. So it's primarily for freshmen coming into college. And it's a good book. It's a good general overview of all of biology. It's thick and it's got lots of topics in there. But he's going to use this as the basis for his conclusions about macro versus macroevolution. And he does a control F on his online copy of it. And it only contains the word microevolution 19 times, and 13 of them are in the long list of references. For macroevolution at similar figures. For a book that's 1493 pages long, it contains evolution 1,856 times. Uh, these terms aren't very important to know about. Oh, really? You're looking at a first year college textbook and you're searching on what is actually a fairly advanced topic in evolutionary biology, and you're not finding enough of it to satisfy you? Okay, that's that's a really poor set of evidence for your thesis. Then he uses Google's Ngram viewer, and he says that the terms microevolution and macroevolution are virtually non-existent in any literature. I think he's got to be using it wrong. Or more likely, what's happening is he's doing such a broad search that he's not looking at the appropriate literature. So, yeah, if you just open the doors and say, I'm going to look in every single book in existence, you're going to find that micro and macroevolution aren't mentioned that often, relatively speaking. So, strike two, that's a pretty bad argument. And then he goes on to say, okay, he's going to mention a scientific source where 1927, the terms were invented by a Russian entomologist, etc. And then he's going to complain that it was brought up by Goldschmidt in 1940. I'll say more about Goldschmidt in a minute. And he says it was caused by a special type of mutation called a macromutation. No, Goldschmidt had a more nuanced view of it than that. But even so, I don't think Goldschmidt is a good source here. Goldschmidt had his own hobby horses that have not borne fruit, if you can imagine horses bearing fruit. But okay, anyway, it just didn't pan out. It was some interesting idea that it just did not hold up. And then he says, biology has long since moved on from these ideas. Really, that this person has not given adequate evidence for this. And then he mentions, okay, nowadays macroevolution refers to any aspect of evolutionary theory that applies only above the species level. Okay, that's fine. It's not a unique process on its own. No, it's a field of study. You're looking at it through the wrong lens here. Um, and then he says, but it's rather simply the result of microevolution. No, it's not. Again, it's more complicated than this is going to make it out to be. Okay. And then he gives a final anecdote. As I'm not a biologist, it's probably not worth anything, he says. I have never once heard the terms macroevolution in any other context in my biology education whatsoever. Only evolution was discussed. I believe him because he's only taken introductory biology. He hasn't studied evolutionary biology. So this is a terrible, terrible argument. An engineer who doesn't know biology is now telling us what advanced concepts in biology are acceptable to him. Okay. His conclusion, he says, I will tentatively go with no. The terms originally had a definition, but it was proven invalid with further developments in biology. Nowadays, while there are professional definitions, they are a bit vague because he doesn't read the right literature. And what does he conclude here? For the most part, the terms are only ever used by creationists. No, don't cite creationists because they don't understand anything, and they would get it wrong if they talked about it. So this is kind of a silly thing. It's just bad arguments all the way through that he's making these arguments. So what I would say is, if you want to know about micro versus macro evolution, there's a couple of angles to take. One is just not Campbell Biology, which again, Campbell Biology is a great book. It's a good introductory textbook, and I've used it and I like it. Find a real book in evolutionary biology. So here's one. This is the one I use for teaching evolution. Evolutionary Analysis by Heron and Freeman. And let's open it up and see what they have to say. So, excuse me, I'll just read the paragraph here. There's a lot more. It's got a whole section on these various topics. But here's what he says at the beginning. The theory of descent with modification includes 5 elements missing from special creation. First, species are not immutable but change through time. In a population of birds, for example, the average beak size may change from one generation to the next. This is known as microevolution. And you may have also heard the definition. It's changes in allele frequency over time. So I don't think he's arguing with that, I hope. Microevolution is a valid concept. And he says, second, lineages split and diverge, thereby increasing the number of species. An ancestral species of birds, for instance, may give rise to two distinct descendant species. This is called speciation. Third, over long periods of time, novel forms of life can derive from earlier forms. Tetrapods, for example, arose from a lineage of fish. This kind of dramatic change over time is called macroevolution. This book mentions macroevolution and microevolution multiple times. Um, Fourth, species are derived not independently, but from common, that is, shared ancestors. All species are thus genealogically related. He quotes Darwin. I should infer, Darwin said on The Origin of Species, that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on the earth have descended from some one primordial form. And finally, the earth and life are considerably more than 6,000 years old. So this is about all the attention a real evolutionary book gives to creationism. And they use the concepts of micro and macro evolution to rebut the argument from this terrible Reddit post. Okay, as I said, this goes on for quite a while and talks in more details about these subjects. But let me switch gears a little bit. So this is the textbook. We use this. I use this to teach upper level undergraduates. There are other, even more sophisticated texts that are used for teaching at the graduate level. But this is pretty weighty stuff for an undergraduate. So let me mention another source, a source that I kind of like. This is from 1979. It's titled Macroevolution, Pattern and Process. So it's a whole book on macroevolution. Believe me, it's real. This is by Stephen Stanley, it's also a very good book to discuss punctuated equilibrium. So he's one of the supporters of punctuated equilibrium, and he goes on at length about that as well. But let me just turn to the opening introduction here, where he gives a little historical overview. So let's see, where is it? It's somewhere in here. He focuses on the fact that macroevolution is usually the domain of paleontologists, not geneticists, and so it's got a different angle. And all too often, macroevolution is dismissed by people who are, let's see, what should we say, snobs about genetics and allele frequencies and all that sort of stuff. So it says, even so, there have been highlights in the progress of paleontology within its traditional bounds, perhaps the brightest of these being the publication of G.G. Simpson's Tempo and Mode in Evolution in 1944, and to a lesser extent, because of overlap, its sequel, The Major Features of Evolution from 1953. So yeah, you can't talk about macroevolution without talking about George Gaylord Simpson, okay? You, and this is old stuff. So, maybe it's not talked about so much in first year biology classes. It says, using taxa above the species level as units of analysis, Simpson fleshed out the skeleton of classical paleontology with facts and interpretations relating to rates, trends, and patterns of large-scale evolution. So macroevolution is about evolution on the large scale, not the generation by generation changes in allele frequencies, but major events in evolutionary history. It says, in the first book, but not in the second, Simpson adopted the idea of Goldschmidt, 1940, that evolutionary research could be divided into the study of microevolution, or changes within species, and the study of macroevolution, or evolution above the species level. That's kind of the standard definition of both of those. I don't see why you can dismiss macroevolution unless you're saying that there's no changes above the species level. What? You gotta look at the fossil record and look at the history of life on Earth. Anyway, he goes on to point out Goldschmidt believed that a natural discontinuity actually exists within the evolution of life, that species in higher taxa arise only through sudden chromosomal changes, while the conventional process of natural selection acts upon genes to produce only lesser modifications within species. Uh, this is a complicated issue. Do I want to get into this? Maybe a little bit. Uh, I really like Goldschmidt. He had some brilliant ideas, and he pointed out some important phenomena. But his idea that you needed macro evolutionary changes, that you need a special class of mutations in order to generate morphological novelties, for instance, no, that has not held up. It's not true anymore. Well, it wasn't true then, but I don't know anybody who really accepts that anymore. But still, it was an interesting idea, and you can't ignore the kinds of phenomena that Goldschmidt was talking about, like phenocopies and differences between sexes and the effects of teratogens producing dramatic morphological changes. And I mean, we can just point to the fact that there are men and women in our species, and they have rather substantial differences between them, complex differences with gradations in between the two. How do we account for those with just allele frequencies? You can't. Okay. So, what is he going to say? Let's see. Simpson's temporary acceptance of the division into micro and macro evolution did not stem from acceptance of Goldschmidt's beliefs. Yeah. So now he's interesting, but he's probably not right. But seems instead to have manifested a practical recognition that evolution was being studied in two separate ways. Biologists, limited by their own generation times, examined infinitesimal changes within living populations. Paleontologists, saddled with an incomplete fossil record, adopted a coarse grained approach concerning themselves mainly with genera, families, and orders. Yeah, so you see this kind of significant operational difference? If you are a geneticist, of course, your focus is going to be on the small changes in allele frequencies because that's the kind of thing you can measure, and also phenotypic effects and fun things like this. If you are a paleontologist, if you're looking at the grand picture of life, the history of life for thousands and millions of years, you're going to have a different aspect that you look at. You're going to look at the phenotypes, and you're going to look at how they change over long periods of time, and you don't have access to genes, so you're not even going to consider those except indirectly. So anyway, yeah, this is a classic macroevolution pattern and process by Stephen Stanley. I've had this copy for many years. I haven't been able to find it elsewhere. Maybe it's on Amazon. I don't know, but it's a good book to look at for the grand perspective on this. Stephen Stanley was also a great supporter of Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge and their views on macroevolution. Again, you don't get to dismiss Gould and Eldredge when you're discussing this kind of thing. So this is all really important. Uh, I want to say some more, but let me just take a look at the comments here so I don't miss anything because they'll slide by. Uh, Doing this live on election night is the most PZ thing ever. Oh, I don't know. I'm not talking about spiders, am I? That would make it a little more PZ. Um, yes, and Larry Parker says you have a biology second edition Campbell right here. I think they're the most popular general biology text at the undergraduate level. So yeah, I've got multiple copies because I have been teaching from that book since, let me think, 1993. So yeah, and I'm one of those people who tends to keep old editions. I'm going to have to purge some; they're kind of piling up. But I keep the old editions because if I want to compare how things change over time, they don't change very fast. There's many superfluous editions of Campbell. but also because I can loan them out to students if they can't afford the monster text. What is it? It's like $170 now. Um, so that's been kind of nice. So I just want to keep track of that, but they're going to go. Um, Nice to see some sanity amid what's going on tonight. Oh, I hope it's not getting too insane. Don't make me look. I don't want to know that it's going insane. Um, yeah, so I'm not. I'm avoiding that stress altogether. Then someone mentions there's also turbo evolution if you believe the young Earthers and that Noah's Ark story. Yeah, we don't believe that here. Nobody here believes that, right? Because that's a garbage theory. That's even worse than dismissing all of macroevolution. Um, it's just really bad science. And like I said, this article on Reddit mentions that he thinks it only comes from creationists. No, it doesn't. And you should not pay any attention to creationists ever. It's a total waste of time, as I know from years of wrestling with them. Let me just point out that when you go to the comments in this Reddit article, there are a lot of good comments that point out that no, that's not right. Um, I think I even made a comment in here that what you got to do is you got to go look at the scientific literature. It's really easy to do. You go to something like PubMed and you type in macroevolution or microevolution in the search bar, and it will give you pages and pages and pages of legitimate scientific articles talking about these topics. How can you say it's nothing? Okay. So several people are commenting here and saying that, "No, you're nuts." Well, they're Reddit, it's really annoying because it's more polite than that. But anyway, they're saying, "No, that's not the case." Let's see, somebody makes the point, "Oh, yeah, just look at, splitting lineages like the cichlids in Lakes Tanganyika. That's a good example." You cannot explain the variation in these species by purely microevolutionary methods. It why did you get these differences in gene frequencies in the first place? Yeah, you gotta explain that. What kind of pressures are compelling these species to diverge as they are? And it's things like drift and, uh, just, separation of populations and, also if you read Stanley here, he'll talk about things like species sorting, phenomena that you can't explain with just simple microevolutionary techniques. There were lots of other comments here. One good thing I can say about this Reddit thread is that there were a lot of comments, and most of them, I think, just looking at them superficially, uh, were telling this person that no, that's wrong, and also pointing out, no, it's not a creationist concept. This was micro and macroevolution were coined by a scientist and have been adopted by lots of different scientists in different disciplines like paleontology versus genetics. And they're pointing out, yeah, these have legitimate scientific meanings. Of course, then you also find people um, saying things like, as far as I know, micro and macroevolution are based on an outdated debate in evolutionary biology from the 20s to 30s. As far as they know, which is not very far apparently. Um, let's see. The distinction between micro and macroevolution is simply irrelevant in scientific discourse. It is one and the same process, somebody says. Oh man. You know, there are different disciplines studying evolutionary biology, and they have different methodologies, different perspectives, different processes. And you can't just simply tell all paleontologists that forget it, you're just supposed to measure allele frequencies because they can't. And they're not interested in that level of fine difference. They're interested in the big scope, the patterns that you see over long terms of evolutionary history. So, uh, someone else says, I was in medicine, microbiology, and public health for almost 40 years. And you don't need to split up the term evolution. Well, yeah, this guy might be very intelligent, might be very well educated and informed, but he's coming at it from this tiny, narrow little perspective. And from his perspective, no, it doesn't. But he's not looking at the big patterns in evolutionary history. Um, yeah, let's see. Is there anything else worthwhile in this thread? Lots of people just flatly saying these are legitimate terms. Uh, and here's one saying lay people really can't answer this question, so expect proper citation for provided answers. Yeah. And then people are citing things like PNAS and Science and Nature and the Royal Society. All of these discuss the topic. Also, if you're on a general level, go to UC Berkeley, and they have a whole site giving an overview of evolution. And yeah, they talk about macro and micro evolution. It's kind of embarrassing that some people are just dismissing this out of hand. And yeah, okay. So I could bang on about this. I just I just find it really annoying. We got a question here. Isn't macroevolution mostly geobiology? Well, yeah, or biogeog. Yeah, sure. It's biogeography. It's paleontology. Um, it's anything that is looking at large scale patterns in geology, for instance, and how those are affected in um, the life on Earth. You could also say things like climatology are going to be really important. Are you going to explain the ice ages with simple changes in allele frequency? Um, those were large scale climate changes that had dramatic effects on organisms, but you can't just say, well, it's a particular kind of allele frequency that's changed. No, that's looking at one of the consequences, not the causes. So that doesn't really fit either. So anyway, yeah. So as I said at the beginning, Reddit is kind of annoying to me because of this population of Redditors who might be intelligent, who might be well informed. They're not creationists, but there's this arrogance that they think they know huge whole fields of complex biology that they can dismiss and explain just by saying, "Ah, it's just microevolution." This has been a pattern, and in the history of evolutionary biology as well, that population genetics and genetics in general have been so successful in explaining so many phenomena, and the proponents of those disciplines tend to take a kind of elitist view. Not all of them. Some of them are recognizing that, yeah, that pluralism is important for understanding evolution. But you get a lot who are just not very good at broadening their mind to encompass all this complexity. So here, let me give you another quote, because if you're going to talk about this, you got to go to a paleontologist. So Stanley, for instance, is a good source. This is Niles Eldridge, one of the co-proponents of punctuated equilibrium. And he says, the very term macroevolution is enough to make an ultra-Darwinian snarl. Yeah, there is a little bit of a turf war going on, has been for a long time, that, yeah, we like to call the people who are so adamant that microevolution is everything, we call them ultra-Darwinians sometimes. Macroevolution is counterposed with microevolution, generation by generation selection, mediated change in gene frequencies within populations. The debate is over the question, are conventional Darwinian microevolutionary processes sufficient to explain the entire history of life? To ultra Darwinians, the very term macroevolution suggests that the answer is automatically no. To them, macroevolution implies the action of processes even genetic processes that are as yet unknown but must be imagined to yield a satisfactory explanation of the history of life. He goes on to say, but macroevolution need not carry such heavy conceptual baggage. In its most basic usage, it simply means evolution on a large scale. In particular, to some biologists, it suggests the origin of major groups, such as the origin and radiation of mammals, or the derivation of whales and bats from terrestrial mammal ancestors. Such sorts of events may or may not demand additional theory for their explanation. Traditional Darwinian explanation, of course, insists not. And you get the problem here. There's a little bit of a turf war going on, and the macroevolution proponents are trying to stake out that there are certain phenomena that you cannot explain with simple microevolutionary genetics. And I agree with them. Maybe eventually we'll figure out something, we'll distill something down uh, that encompasses it. But the theory doesn't do it yet. And I personally think, no, we're going to have to continue to look at the influence of other processes on a different scale. I come at this from the perspective of a developmental biologist. And what I would say is that another phenomenon that isn't explained by microevolution is developmental constraints. So there was a recent paper, I think it was in Science, which was talking about um, looking at the correlation between limb lengths, forelimbs and hind limbs. And it pointed out that in birds, they seem to be uncoupled, that you can have different lengths of arms and legs in different lineages, of course. This is, again, we're talking macroevolutionary phenomena. Uh, but that in animals like bats, those lengths are more tightly correlated, that there's some constraint in the genome of mammals that says, no, if you make this limb this length, you have to make this other limb a different length, a certain longer length, that you can't just simply uncouple them and have them develop freely. We also see this phenomenon in something I've written about before, like you look at cervical vertebrae. We have only 7. We're constrained. We can only have 7 cervical vertebrae. Well, you look at things like birds and plesiosaurs, you got 20, 30 cervical vertebrae. Those those are free to change in those lineages. You can't explain that with microevolution because there are circumstances, look at a giraffe, for instance, where it would be advantageous. Well, it's clearly advantageous for a giraffe to have a long neck. They got long necks, but they have to do it with 7 vertebrae. And that makes them so that they're not quite as flexible as a bird's neck. A goose neck is much more flexible than that. And so this is a constraint imposed on them by their history that has to be considered when you're asking how do things evolve. So it's a lot of different things. Um, I'll also mention I've got a quote here from Stephen Jay Gould. There are people who do not like Stephen Jay Gould and just immediately dismiss anything he says. But I hope this audience isn't that goofy, that narrow-minded. So Gould says we do not advance some special theory for long times and large transitions, fundamentally opposed to the processes of microevolution. So he's saying there's no conflict between these two. Rather, we maintain that nature is organized hierarchically and that no smooth continuum leads across levels. We may attain a unified theory of process, but the processes work differently at different levels, and we cannot extrapolate from one level to encompass all events at the next. I believe, in fact, that speciation by splitting guarantees that macroevolution must be studied at its own level. Selection among species is not an extrapolation of changes in gene frequencies within populations. May the motor of may be the motor of macroevolutionary trends. Macroevolution is, as I believe, mainly a story of the differential success of certain kinds of species. And if most species change little in the phyletic mode during the course of their existence, then microevolutionary change within populations is not the stuff by extrapolation of major transformations. Yeah, and again, Stanley talks about this as well. Things like species sorting, that there are phenomena that that operate at the level of species and higher taxonomic levels that affects the next generation, and the affects which individuals can survive into the next generation. And I would say that, for instance, my example of cervical vertebrae is an example of that. There are limits that mammals cannot cross there that birds and other reptiles can. So how do we encompass that in microevolutionary theory? We can't. We've got to look at a bigger picture. Anyway, so that's my little type. Oh, I've been talking for 40 minutes. Oh, I'm sorry. I know you're all anxious to get away and go watch the news and see what's happening there, right? Any questions or arguments? Otherwise, I can just fold up shop and go take a nap or something. No, I wouldn't take a nap. I've got books to read. I got lectures to prepare. Oh yeah, so other people are not anxious to retire to the news either. Yeah. Question: aren't there epigenetic mechanisms for body segmentation? What do you mean by for body segmentation? I mean, we know quite a bit about segmentation, and we know that there are specific molecular mechanisms that do that. Uh, yeah, so you cannot just there. Oh, let's see how to explain this. So yes, there are microevolutionary processes that can explain the specific details of segmentation, but that's not enough because, um, for example, uh, why do fruit flies segment in one way, but centipedes and millipedes segment in a different way? Yeah, there are other things going on. Furthermore, if we look at vertebrates, vertebrates are also segmented animals, and we can see that they use many of the same molecules as a fruit fly, but they're modified and they work in somewhat different ways. So, fruit flies, for instance, have some kind of global regulation of the pattern. There's big picture regulation of where you're going to make segments, and in vertebrates, we've got more of a clock-like mechanism that doles out tissue into segments sequentially. So, but for instance, they both use the pair rule gene hairy. They're just using them in different ways. Oh, let's see. Okay. Um, any good new biology books in popular science worth reading? Oh, what a that's an interesting question. I should look into that. Yeah, I have not been reading a lot of deep biology texts lately because I'm teaching a course in the history of evolutionary thought. So I've been reading a heck of a lot of history and philosophy, and it's all old fuddy-duddy stuff. You know, I'm teaching the 19th century history of biology in the class right now, and I'm looking forward to next week getting into the 20th century finally. So yeah, I'm a stick in the mud. I'm a little bit behind. Yeah, ask me next semester when I've actually get back into, contemporary science. Yeah, it's one of the frustrations of this semester is I'm so buried in ancient history, 100-year-old books and things, uh, that I haven't been making, as much progress in keeping up with contemporary stuff. But, that'll change. Let's see, what determines the number of nipples in mammalian development? Oh, that's a really good question. I saw something about that a while back. Um, I'll have to get back to you on that. I have to go look that up. But, we all have these milk lines along the length of the torso, and it's along those lines that we differentiate mammary gland tissue. And, was it a Hox gene connection? I think it might have been something to do with the Hox genes are regulating these areas, and, in us, those genes are silencing mammary gland production in everything below a certain level. But I'd have to double check to be really sure about that. Does that business in the Bible about looking at peeled sticks making goats have speckled babies count as evolution? No, no, nothing in the Bible counts. The Bible is completely devoid of any evidence or theorizing about evolutionary change. Again, I'm teaching this history of evolutionary thought course, and this is one of the things that comes crystal clear is that up until Darwin, well, there was a few other people who had similar ideas, but up until roughly the age of Darwin, uh, people were convinced that in special creation models, that they did not think, if you look at people like Cuvier and Lamarck and all these other old-timey biologists, they were pretty much convinced that species did not change in any significant way. Lamarck did allow a little bit of variation within a lineage, but not crossing species boundaries, that all species were unique. So if they couldn't think of this in the 18th century, why would you think that the biology would have any evidence for it or any proposal for it? It's absent from the Bible and it's absent from philosophical thought in all of that time. Yeah, I can think of an occasional Greek philosopher, an occasional radical philosopher later who did suggest that there was something going on about transformation, uh, and transformation was a concept in Greek mythology, for instance, so it fit right in. But they didn't go to the lengths that Darwin did of proposing wholesale transformation of species over time as a mechanism for generating biological diversity in particular. So yeah, no, yeah. Okay, yes, I know you're being sarcastic. I was just sarcastically taking you seriously for a moment. But yeah, this is one of the surprising things about the creationist movement is that they rely on the Bible, and the Bible says nothing about biology. The kinds of biology that it talks about are so crude and primitive. It's folk biology, and it's not founded in anything interesting. So, um, oh no, oh no, you had to ask that question. Curious about your thoughts on using evolutionary psychology to explain morality. No, thank you. Evolutionary psychology is a terrible discipline. It's a poor approach to studying much of anything. And you know, evolutionary psychology thinks that it's one of those ultra Darwinian sorts of philosophies where it thinks everything is a product of adaptation, everything is selected for, and you can't do that. Phenomena like morality, I think, are a higher level function that are more subject to cultural biases. And if genetics plays a role at all, it's in drift. So just random genetic changes underlying some biases in the human mind. But if you're looking for the details about morality, should we kill people? That's a social function. That's something that cultures inculcate in people. And so, no, I do not accept that at all. The biology is complicated. There's a whole bunch of phenomena going on in us, and you can't blithely suggest that they're all the product of some kind of selective event because they're not. That we have so much variation in, you know, moral beliefs, moral behaviors, and general activity, general behavior that it would be foolish to suggest that they are all the product of selection for an ideal. There just doesn't work. Okay, yeah. So now I've shut down another question. Just boom. That's one of the difficult things about these is I am a very opinionated guy, if you don't know, and I tend to sort of dismiss a lot of things. Like I